The chime cut through the dark like a thread snapped in the night. I sat upright before I even knew why. In the stillness of our suburban house, the small screen on my nightstand glowed. The baby monitor that I kept pointed toward the downstairs kitchen hummed faintly and pulsed with a soft green light. On its grainy feed, a figure moved past the kitchen table toward the pantry. Her hair was pulled into the loose bun I recognized from dinner hours earlier, and her jacket sleeve brushed the row of spice jars that I arrange in alphabetical order. At the same moment, my doorbell rang twice in quick succession, as though someone wanted in before their courage failed. It was 2 a.m, and my whole street was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the tick of the antique clock in the hall. I reached for my robe and slippers and kept my eyes on the monitor. The digital clock on the coffee maker in that fuzzy image flashed 2:01. When you are a mother, you never stop watching out for the people you love. When you are a grandmother, you learn that vigilance is a kind of love too. I did not yet know that this moment would unravel the careful fabric I had been knitting to keep my family together. You are here with me now, and as I share this story, I hope you will find strength in how I fought for justice without surrendering my heart. Before we go further, please take a moment to like and subscribe if you enjoy these tales of real people navigating complicated lives. Let me know in the comments what city you are listening from and what time it is for you as you hear my midnight call. Stories like this connect us because we all carry secrets and we all yearn for truth. I lived alone on the upper floor of a 2-story home in a quiet neighborhood where porch lights flicker. On timers and mailboxes bear paint from annual touch-ups. My son Daniel and his wife Grace had moved into the lower unit after he lost his job last fall. The arrangement was supposed to be temporary while he looked for new work, and she finished her certification to teach. I charged them a nominal rent only to cover utilities, and they shared our kitchen for Sunday dinners. Daniel is my only child, and after my husband's passing, the idea of his laughter downstairs comforted me more than any television show. Could Grace and I never had the easy friendship I once imagined I would have with a daughter-in-law? She kept her life compartmentalized, her phone always face down on the table, and she bristled when I offered unsolicited advice about childcare or finances. She called me Mrs. instead of Mom even after 5 years of marriage. Daniel chalked it up to her independent streak, and I bit my tongue more times than I can count, because peace is hard-earned once it is broken. Still, I noticed little things, like the time she asked to borrow my car and brought it back with a scratch down the passenger door and no explanation. When I calmly pointed out the scrape, she laughed and said it must have been there already. That laugh stayed with me long after the touch-up paint dried. Earlier that evening, we had celebrated our grandson Noah's 3rd birthday. The table was strewn with torn wrapping paper and half-eaten cupcakes by the time I put the kettle on for tea. Grace had looked distracted all night, glancing at her phone and texting someone between bites of dinner. Daniel told me she was anxious about an upcoming exam, and I told myself not to read too much into it. When they went back downstairs around 9, I tidied up, wiped frosting from the high chair tray, and set the baby monitor to its usual angle so I could hear if Noah woke up crying or if our downstairs smoke detector ever beeped. I kissed the photograph of my late husband that sits by the sink and said my own silent prayer that everything would work out for all of us. Hours later, the monitor delivered a different kind of alert. I slipped down the hallway, the wooden floor cool on my bare feet, and peered through the peephole in my front door. The porch light cast a pale circle over the concrete steps. Grace stood there in the sweatshirt she had worn earlier, clutching a reusable grocery bag against her hip. Her eyes darted around as if she expected someone else to answer. I took a breath and opened the door. "What are you doing here?" I whispered so as not to wake my neighbors. My voice held more curiosity than accusation at that point. Grace gave a small start as though she didn't think I would answer at all. "Oh, Mrs. Thompson," she said, using the formal name she preferred. "Noah woke up crying, and we were out of his medicine. I figured you might have some children's fever syrup since you keep everything in that cabinet. I didn't want to wake you, so I just grabbed it from the kitchen." Her words tumbled out quickly, and she lifted the bag as if to prove she was acting with good intentions. I could see the corner of our blue bottle of pain relief peeking through. My kitchen cabinet does indeed hold a small pharmacy. I keep receipts attached to the inside of the door with a magnet so I know exactly what has been used and when. On that magnet clip, there was a printed slip from 2 weeks ago showing the purchase of that very bottle. I stood aside and motioned for her to come in. I told her to help herself next time and not to scare me half to death with the doorbell. She smiled a tired smile and said she was sorry. Her breath smelled faintly of mint and something metallic. We chatted for less than a minute about how quickly toddlers go through medicine before she hurried back downstairs, and I watched her shadow slip past the hydrangeas, outside as she crossed the yard to the side entrance. When I closed my door, I didn't go back to bed. Something in the pit of my stomach felt wrong. The baby monitor feed showed that in the minute between the second doorbell ring and my opening the door, Grace had gone straight to my pantry, not to the medicine cabinet. I rewound the feed, pressing the small replay button that I rarely used, and watched the greenish image again. At 2:00, she crossed the kitchen floor, opened the cupboard beneath the counter where I keep my lockbox, paused for a full 20 seconds, then slid something into her bag. Only after that did she reach up to the shelf with the medicine. The lockbox is an old metal case with a 3-digit combination that my father used to keep his stamps. Inside, I keep a few heirloom pieces and important documents. I had never told anyone the code except my attorney. It would have been easy to believe her story and go back to sleep. But I come from a generation that believes in looking twice before dismissing a warning. I wrapped my sweater tighter around me and crept downstairs, making sure each stair creaked just the way it always did, so nothing seemed unusual if anyone was listening. The kitchen smelled faintly of the vanilla candles I burn in the evenings, and the dishwasher hummed its quiet cycle. I pulled open the cupboard door and saw that the lockbox was no longer flush against the wall. Its metal corners had left faint lines in the dust. When I lifted it out, the combination dial had fresh scratches around the numbers. Someone had been turning it recently with impatient fingers. I turned the numbers to my code and opened the box. My mother's gold wedding band with its tiny engraving lay in its velvet pouch. My husband's dog tags, the deed to the house, and a faded photograph from our honeymoon were still there. But the envelope containing the latest draft of my will had been disturbed. The corner was bent, and the clip I used to keep the pages together had been removed. One page was askew, as if someone had flipped through it in a hurry. I counted the pages and ran my finger along the typed lines. Nothing seemed missing, but the order was not the same as I had left it. I replaced everything with care and closed the box, then stared at the small scratches around the dial again. They looked fresh, the metal slightly brighter where it had been scraped. Back upstairs, sleep eluded me. The quiet house that normally comforted me now felt like a stage set where something unseen had just happened. I sat at the kitchen table with the monitor turned up slightly so I could hear if Noah coughed. My grandmother's teapot steamed between my hands, and the clock hands crept past 2:30. That is where my mind began to wander backward through the months that led us here. How had we arrived at a point where I was watching my own daughter-in-law on a tiny screen in the middle of the night and doubting her explanations? As I sipped my tea, I started assembling a timeline on the back of an envelope, noting dates and little events that seemed trivial at the time. It was the beginning of an investigation I never thought I would have to conduct within my own family. The next morning, the world looked deceptively ordinary. Sunlight filtered through the blinds and landed on the polished countertop, just as it always did. Blue jays hopped along the backyard fence, pecking at imaginary crumbs. Daniel came upstairs to return my coffee grinder that he had borrowed a week ago. He kissed my cheek, thanked me for the birthday party, and started to apologize for Grace waking me when I cut him off with a hug. I did not want to plant suspicion in him without proof, and I had always taught him that marriages thrived on trust. Instead, I asked how Noah's fever was. Daniel looked confused for a moment before nodding and saying he had been fine once the medicine took effect. There had been no fever, I realized. Noah's cry at 2 must have been for something else entirely. After they left for the park, I retrieved my small notebook from the junk drawer. This notebook had served as my household ledger since the days when grocery clerks punched prices into cash registers by hand. I dated the top of a fresh page and began a column of occurrences that had niggled at me over the past year. Last November, a mail carrier left an envelope from my insurance company that Grace took downstairs because she said she thought it was hers. It turned up opened later with nothing missing, but a week afterward my insurance agent called to verify a change of beneficiary request that I never made. In January, my silver bracelet that I only wear on holidays disappeared from my jewelry box and then reappeared 3 weeks later under a stack of dish towels. In March, our property tax bill showed that someone had looked into the assessed value of my home online. I added last night's scratched combination dial to the list. When I finished writing my memory of each incident, my hand trembled slightly. I was not a detective by profession. I had spent 40 years in a library, helping readers find books and refuge. But librarians know that evidence is built on records. If there was nothing sinister behind these small shifts, then no harm would come from my notes. If there was malice, then my notes would help me tell a coherent story to the authorities. I tucked the notebook into my apron and went outside to water my tomatoes. The familiar motion of winding the hose calmed me. In the distance, a dog barked and a lawnmower started up. Life goes on, even when secrets are taking shape. That afternoon, I visited my neighbor Wendy, who lives 2 houses down and whose front yard is a canvas of rose bushes. We have exchanged house keys for emergencies since our children were in middle school. I asked if her door camera had recorded anything unusual overnight. She smiled and said her motion alerts often caught raccoons and delivery trucks, but she would check. She invited me inside where the living room smelled of lavender, and she pulled up her phone app. The video feed from 1:50 to 2:10 in the morning showed Grace's white sedan pulling out of our driveway at 1:59. Headlights off until it reached the street, then switching on as it turned left toward Maple Avenue. Wendy raised an eyebrow. She said she needed medicine, I whispered. Wendy nodded slowly. I'm not jumping to conclusions, I added. I just need to piece things together. She offered to send me the clip, and by the time I walked home, it had landed in my email inbox with a timestamp and a file size of 3.2 megabytes. I saved it to a new folder on my computer labeled Simply Questions. Next, I checked my own security system logs. My doorbell records each press with a time and date. At 1:58, the log showed 2 quick rings. At 2:14, the side gate sensor picked up movement heading away from the house. The system does not record video in that direction, but it does note when the gate opens. I printed the log and highlighted those 2 entries. The printer ink smudged a little where my hand rested on the paper, leaving a faint streak like the beginning of an underlined sentence. Grace had said she needed children's fever syrup. I checked the bottle in the bag she had carried. It was half full, consistent with occasional use. I compared the weight to the last time I had used it and made a note. I also looked at the magnet clip in my medicine cabinet where I keep receipts. The slip of paper from the pharmacy, dated 2 weeks earlier, showed that I had bought the medicine and a box of adhesive bandages. It listed the total amount and the last 4 digits of my card. I took a photograph of the receipt with my phone and printed it. Evidence, even if mundane, mattered because it created a chain of verifiable events. Days passed while I observed without confronting. I watched Grace's comings and goings with a new eye. On Tuesday, she left the house at 9:20 in the morning, said she had a study group, and returned at 11:30, carrying a shopping bag with the logo of a jewelry consignment store on Bay Street. Her cheeks were flushed from the warm spring sun. She waved at me from the sidewalk and mentioned that she had found a good deal on a dress for an upcoming wedding. I smiled and made small talk while filing that detail away. That evening, after Daniel went to bed, she left again at 11:15 with the same bag. At midnight, my phone buzzed with a bank alert that $200 had been withdrawn from my checking account at an ATM on Bay Street. The text included the last 4 digits of my card and the exact time. I had my card in my wallet at home. When I checked my purse, the card was there, but the magnetic strip felt warm as if it had recently been handled. I changed my banking password and added this to my timeline. My sense of unease deepened into something almost like grief. I grieved the trust I had extended and the innocence of our shared dinners. I also felt a surge of determination that no one would take advantage of my love of family. I made an appointment with my attorney, Ms. Patel, who had helped me update my will after my husband passed. Her office was downtown, in a building with frosted glass doors and a wall of framed credentials. I arrived 15 minutes early with my notebook and the printed logs in a manila folder. Ms. Patel listened carefully, her pen poised above a legal pad. She did not interrupt as I described the baby monitor footage, the scratches on my lockbox, and the bank alert. When I finished, she asked if I had considered installing additional cameras or if I had confronted Grace. "Not yet," I replied. "I don't want to accuse her of something so serious without ironclad proof. I also don't want to push her away from my grandson. He adores her." Ms. Patel nodded and said caution was wise. She suggested that I document everything and to trust my instincts. If I felt that my safety or my assets were at risk, she could file for a restraining order or contact the district attorney about elder abuse. Hearing the term elder abuse applied to me sent a chill down my spine. I was not frail. I still shoveled my own driveway and balanced my own checkbook. But abuse is not only about physical harm. It can be about financial exploitation and manipulation. She also reminded me that under recent state law, anyone who suspects financial abuse of an elderly person is obligated to report it. The burden of proof would require more than suspicion. She advised installing a covert camera near my lockbox, changing my will's security protocols, and alerting my bank to require extra verification for any changes. Before I left, she printed a list of recommended steps, each bullet numbered neatly and underlined with her fountain pen. I tucked it in my folder next to my timeline. I walked back to my car past a cafe where two young women laughed over iced lattes. The smell of espresso and pastries drifted out. I used to meet Grace here in the early days of her marriage when she still sought my advice. One time she asked me how to prepare Daniel's favorite apple pie. I wrote the recipe on a napkin, and she tucked it into her planner. I wondered now if those moments had been genuine or if she had always had another plan. My chest tightened as I sat in the driver's seat and watched traffic pass, the clock on the dashboard reading 11:47. I started the engine and resolved to follow the attorney's suggestions. That evening, I visited an electronics store and purchased a small motion-activated camera disguised as a smoke detector. It came with a tiny instruction manual and a micro SD card. The cashier scanned the box and handed me a receipt that I folded neatly and placed in my ledger. Back home, I installed the device on the ceiling above the pantry. Its white plastic casing blended with the existing smoke detector so well that even I had to look twice to tell them apart. I tested it by opening the cupboard and closing it 3 times. The camera recorded each action with a date and timestamp burned into the corner of the video. I set the recording interval to 1 minute after movement and hid the SD card reader behind a stack of cookbooks. Grace continued her routine unaware of my new watchfulness. On Wednesday, she spent the morning studying at the dining table. The overhead light reflected off her glossy textbook pages. She hummed under her breath to a tune I did not recognize and made herself a sandwich without asking if I wanted one. Noah played quietly with his toy train on the rug. I pretended to dust the bookshelf while noting the way her eyes flickered toward the pantry whenever I left the room. Nothing happened that day. On Thursday, she left mid-afternoon for what she said was a dentist appointment. She returned an hour later. When she thought I had gone for my walk, she slipped into the kitchen, opened the cupboard, and used a piece of paper to shield her fingers while she turned the lockbox dial. I watched from the downstairs hallway through the crack of the half-closed door and recorded my observation time in my notebook. I did not intervene because I wanted the camera to capture her actions. That night, I retrieved the SD card and plugged it into my laptop. The software loaded the footage automatically. At 2:13 p.m., the camera detected movement. Grace entered the kitchen and glanced over her shoulder before opening the cupboard. She reached for the lockbox, hesitated, pulled a folded tissue from her pocket and draped it over her fingers. She spun the dial 3 times clockwise, twice counterclockwise, and once clockwise again. Her brow furrowed as she tried to guess the numbers. After 30 seconds, she stopped, wiped the dial with the tissue, and returned the box to its place. She then opened the upper cabinet, grabbed a jar of peanut butter and a loaf of bread, as if that had been her intention all along. I sat back in my chair and exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. This recording did not show theft, but it showed intent and premeditation. It proved she knew where I kept my valuables. The following morning, I decided to test her reaction. I left an unsealed envelope on the kitchen counter with Daniel's name written on it. Inside, I placed a note that read, "Bank called about recent withdrawal. Call me." I went upstairs and waited. Within 10 minutes, I heard footsteps and the rustling of paper. The baby monitor captured her opening the envelope, reading the note, and then pulling her phone from her pocket. She dialed a number quickly. I muted the monitor sound to avoid eavesdropping, but made note of the call time. Later that day, while Daniel was outside grilling, Grace approached me with a breezy smile. "Oh, by the way, I think the bank mixed up your account with someone else's," she said. "I saw a weird text on your phone. Probably a scam. Thank you for letting me know," I responded. "I'll handle it." Inside, I marked another tick on my growing chart of her deflections. Every move I made, she countered with a seemingly helpful suggestion, as though guiding me away from seeing what was right in front of me. The tension of secrets wove through my days like a taut thread. I still read bedtime stories to Noah, still laughed at Daniel's jokes, still pruned my rose bushes. But part of my mind was now a quiet investigator's office lined with notes and files. Late at night, I would open my notebook and cross-reference times. 2 minutes after the text from the bank about the withdrawal, there had been a call from an unfamiliar number on our landline. I logged on to our phone provider's website and printed the call records for the past 6 weeks. The number popped up repeatedly, often in the afternoon when I was out running errands. I looked it up online and discovered it belonged to a pawn shop on Bay Street. They specialized in buying gold and silver. My stomach dropped. I debated how much to involve Daniel. He had always stood up for his wife, which is honorable, but denial can blind a good man. I decided to gather more proof before breaking his heart. I called the pawn shop pretending to inquire about selling a silver bracelet. A male voice answered, and when I asked about transaction records, he explained that they scan IDs and keep records for law enforcement. I thanked him and hung up. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes, but it confirmed what I suspected. If Grace had sold something of mine, there would be a record. I needed access to it legally. I made a note to speak with Officer Martinez, a community liaison I knew from my volunteer work at the senior center. He had given a presentation last month about fraud prevention and offered his card for questions. As the end of the week approached, my timeline filled with dates, receipts and short sentences like March 14th, Grace took insurance letter. Each entry anchored my emotions to facts. My attorney's paper with its bullet points lay on my desk, reminding me to remain calm and methodical. I realized that my family drama was no longer just about personal hurt. Financial exploitation of elders is a crime with legal remedies. My story might soon unfold before strangers in uniforms or suits. That realization settled over me with both dread and relief. I was not alone in this, and there were laws designed to protect people like me. On Saturday morning, a heavy envelope arrived in the mail addressed to me and stamped with my bank's logo. Inside was a monthly statement that included transactions I had not authorized. There were 3 transfers totaling $6,000 from my savings to an external account under the name G. Roberts. I did not recognize the name. The transfers had occurred on April 10th, April 28th, and May 2nd, dates when Grace had been at home claiming to study for her exams. My heart pounded as I read the statement. Attached to the last page was a standard fraud warning advising customers to contact the bank immediately if they suspected unauthorized activity. I dialed the customer service number and explained the situation to the representative. They placed a freeze on my account, reversed the most recent transfer, and asked me to visit the branch with identification to file an affidavit of unauthorized transfer. I wrote down the representative's name, reference number, and the time and date of the call on a sticky note that I stuck to the front of my notebook. That afternoon, Daniel took Noah to his swim class. giving me a window to check the lockbox again. Inside, I found a receipt I had not placed there, a carbon copy from a notary office dated April 12th. The document indicated that a power of attorney had been granted by one Susan Thompson to one Grace Roberts. The signature looked like mine, but the handwriting was slightly off, the loops on the S too wide, the T crossed higher than I normally write. My hands shook as I held the receipt up to the light. Grace's last name before she married my son was Roberts. I had never signed such a document. Someone had forged my signature to grant Grace legal authority over my finances. I photographed the receipt, placed it back exactly where I found it, and closed the box. Then I sat at the table and cried quietly for the first time since my husband died. Betrayal has a way of hitting you in waves, each one forcing you to reckon with a new depth of trust broken. When my tears subsided, I composed myself and called Officer Martinez. He answered on the second ring. I told him I believed I was a victim of financial exploitation by a family member and that I had evidence including forged documents, unauthorized bank transfers, and surveillance footage. He expressed immediate concern, reminded me that I had done the right thing by documenting everything, and arranged to meet me at the police station on Monday morning. He also advised me to secure my important documents in a place Grace could not access before then. I thanked him and hung up, noting the time and the way his calm demeanor steadied me. Over the next 2 days, Grace's behavior grew bolder, as if emboldened by her belief that she had gotten away with it. On Sunday, she brought home a new tablet computer. When I complimented it, she casually mentioned that she had received an unexpected scholarship refund. She offered to help me set up automatic bill pay on my accounts, saying it would make my life easier. Her offer felt like salt on a wound. I smiled and told her I preferred to keep doing things my way. Later that evening, she left a pamphlet about assisted living facilities on the coffee table. "Just options," she said brightly when she noticed me looking at it. My cheeks flushed with anger, but I swallowed my words and nodded. An older woman living alone is often told she should consider moving. But when the suggestion comes from someone who is slowly draining your savings, it takes on a sinister tone. Monday morning arrived with gray skies heavy with rain. I tucked my notebook, the forged receipt, printed bank statements, the SD card, and the copy of Wendy's video into my purse. I wore my wool coat and clutched an umbrella as I walked into the precinct. The fluorescent lights buzzed, and the air smelled of disinfectant. Officer Martinez met me in a small conference room with a formica table and chairs that squeaked. He took each piece of evidence I handed him and placed it in a clear evidence bag with a label. He asked clarifying questions and typed notes into a computer. I showed him the video of Grace attempting to open the lockbox and the photograph of the notary receipt. He grimaced when he saw the words "power of attorney." "Do you recall ever signing anything like this?" he asked. "Never," I replied. My attorney would have insisted on being present for any such document. "The notary stamp is real, but the signature is not." He nodded and said, "Forging a power of attorney is a serious offense." He explained that the investigation would involve interviewing the notary, obtaining bank records, and possibly executing a search warrant if the district attorney deemed it necessary. Because the suspect lived in my home, there would need to be careful coordination to avoid tipping her off prematurely. He warned me that cases like this could take time, but that the evidence I had was compelling. He also offered to connect me with a victim's advocate who could provide emotional support and resources. Leaving the station, I felt both relieved and vulnerable. The official involvement of law enforcement meant that I was no longer carrying the burden alone, but it also meant that the situation had escalated to a level where consequences would cascade through my family. I drove home in the rain, windshield wipers squeaking in rhythm, thinking about how to tell Daniel. He deserved to know that his wife had betrayed not only me but him as well. Yet I wanted to approach him with compassion, not accusation. I rehearsed the words in my mind as the traffic light at Elm Street turned yellow and then red. When I arrived, Daniel was in the garage sorting tools. I asked him to join me in the living room. He wiped his hands on a rag and followed me, his brow furrowed with concern. I sat him down, placed the folder of evidence on the coffee table, and told him gently that I loved him more than anything, but I had discovered that Grace had been taking money from me without my permission. His eyes widened and then narrowed. He opened the folder and leafed through the documents in disbelief. He recognized the notary receipt and admitted that he had signed as a witness because Grace told him it was a transfer of power to handle my medical appointments. The color drained from his face as he realized he had unwittingly become part of her scheme. "I didn't read it carefully," he whispered. "She said it was just a formality. She said she wanted to make sure you were taken care of. I trusted her." His voice broke on the last word. I reached across the table and took his hand. "Trusting your spouse is not a weakness, Daniel," I said softly. "She should have protected you from this, not used your trust. We will fix this together." He nodded, tears pooling in his eyes. We sat there, mother and son, holding hands over the documents that spelled out the breach of our trust. The clock ticked louder than usual, as if marking the end of an era. Our conversation stretched into the afternoon as we planned our next steps. Daniel insisted on confronting Grace that evening. I cautioned him that doing so without law enforcement present could jeopardize the investigation. He reluctantly agreed to wait until Officer Martinez advised us. We decided that Daniel would begin sleeping with Noah in the upstairs guest room. I would change the locks on the main doors. We would monitor Grace's actions closely, but not engage in arguments. Daniel looked at me with gratitude mixed with shame. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said. "I should have seen it." "Abusers hide their actions carefully," I reassured him. "You are a good man. That's why you didn't see it." That night, however, the situation escalated without our choosing. Grace returned home earlier than usual, her face flushed, her eyes bright. She walked into the kitchen, where Daniel and I sat, and looked at the documents spread on the table. Her expression changed in an instant from surprise to defiance. "Going through my things now?" she snapped. "These aren't your things," Daniel replied quietly. "We need to talk." Grace crossed her arms and laughed, a high-pitched sound devoid of humor. "You think you can control everything," she said to me, her voice dripping with contempt. "You always have your nose in our marriage. You couldn't stand the thought of us having a life separate from you." "This isn't about control," I responded. "It's about the unauthorized transfers and the forged document." Grace's eyes darted to the forged receipt. "You're losing your memory," she shot back. "You asked me to help with your accounts. You thanked me. Maybe you should think about moving somewhere safe where professionals can take care of you." Her words were a clear reference to the assisted living pamphlet. The insinuation stung, but it also revealed her strategy. She wanted to discredit my mental competence so that any claim I made would be seen as confusion. "My memory is sharp enough to recall every withdrawal I make," I said firmly. "The police have been informed." Her face paled at the mention of law enforcement. For a moment I saw fear flash across her eyes. Then she squared her shoulders. "You're overreacting," she muttered, before grabbing her purse and heading for the door. "I'm going to my mother's house," she announced. "I'll take Noah with me." "No," Daniel said, standing between her and the hallway. "Noah stays here tonight." His voice was calm but unyielding. Grace stared at him, her jaw tightening, then turned on her heel and stormed out without another word. The slam of the front door reverberated through the house. Noah, who had been playing quietly in the corner, looked up and began to whimper. I scooped him into my arms and murmured soothing words until his breathing slowed. Daniel moved his tools into the guest room that evening and slept in the bed next to his son. I lay awake replaying the confrontation. I had not expected her to try to flip the narrative so quickly, but manipulation often takes that route. My phone buzzed around midnight with a text from an unknown number. It read, "You will regret this." I showed it to Daniel in the morning, and we both took screenshots. The area code matched the same pawn shop number from earlier. The intimidation tactic only strengthened our resolve. I forwarded the message to Officer Martinez, who responded that he would add it to the file. 2 days later, a detective from the district attorney's office visited our house with Officer Martinez. They carried clipboard and camera, and their presence felt both intrusive and reassuring. They inspected the lockbox, photographed the scratches, and asked detailed questions about the timeline. Daniel provided a statement about signing the document under false pretenses. The detective, Ms. Nguyen, explained that the notary would be subpoenaed to testify about the circumstances under which the power of attorney was notarized. She noted that the bank transfers had been routed through an account in Grace's maiden name. It suggests premeditation, she observed. She also recommended that we file a petition for temporary guardianship of Noah if we felt he might be taken out of state. That last suggestion caught me off guard. The idea that Grace would try to flee with my grandson seemed like a plot from a movie. Yet the forged power of attorney and the sudden suggestion that I was mentally unfit had shown me that she was capable of deception. I spoke with Ms. Patel that afternoon about guardianship. She explained that the court could grant me temporary guardianship if I could demonstrate that remaining with his mother posed immediate risk to Noah's well-being. Daniel would also have to petition for sole custody. The court would look at evidence of financial abuse and any signs that Grace intended to leave the state. The process involved filing several forms, submitting to a home study, and attending a hearing within 3 to 4 weeks. Ms. Patel handed me a packet of forms. I thanked her and we set up a follow-up appointment. My days became a blur of paperwork and watching over Noah. I filled out petitions using black ink and neat block letters, listing out names, dates, and reasons in the spaces provided. The forms asked if either parent had a history of substance abuse or mental health issues. I hesitated before checking the boxes, but ultimately answered truthfully that I did not know. The court would investigate. I attached copies of the bank statements and the forged document to my petition. I also wrote a statement describing the night Grace came into my kitchen at 2 a.m. and the subsequent evidence. Daniel completed his own paperwork for sole custody. We both signed under penalty of perjury that everything was accurate. Meanwhile, Grace made counter-moves. She hired an attorney and filed a petition accusing me of undue influence and claiming that I had fabricated the evidence because I was jealous of her relationship with my son. She attempted to file a restraining order to prevent me from contacting Noah without her presence. She also told anyone who would listen that I was experiencing early-onset dementia. She posted on social media vague messages about toxic family members. Mutual friends reached out to me asking what was going on. I declined to engage in online drama. Instead, I focused on preparing for the legal battle ahead. The court set our temporary guardianship hearing for May 29th. That date became a point on my mental calendar around which everything else revolved. 20 days. 20 days to gather more evidence, to prepare testimony, to brace myself for the possibility that a judge could deny our petition and allow Grace unrestricted access to Noah and my finances. Each morning I wrote the number of days remaining at the top of my notebook page like a countdown clock. In the days leading up to the hearing, the detective uncovered more disturbing information. She called to inform us that Grace had opened a credit card in my name 6 months prior. The card had a $10,000 limit and had been nearly maxed out at a series of high-end boutiques and online retailers. I never received statements because they were being sent to a post office box. The address on the application was slightly off from mine by 1 digit, enough for the mail to be held at the post office instead of delivered to my house. The detective had obtained copies of the application and transactions. My signature had been forged again. She explained that the credit card company would remove the charges once they confirmed the fraud, but that my credit score might be temporarily impacted. The discovery hardened my resolve. Grace's actions were not a momentary lapse. They were part of a sustained pattern. Ms. Patel and I compiled a binder labeled Exhibits. Inside, we organized the evidence. Bank statements with unauthorized transfers highlighted, the forged power of attorney receipt, the notary's statement admitting that she had notarized the document without verifying my identity, the credit card application, the pawn shop transaction records obtained through a subpoena, the video footage of Grace attempting to open the lockbox, the phone records showing calls to the pawn shop, and the threatening text message. We also included letters from 2 neighbors who had witnessed unusual behavior, including Wendy's letter stating that she had seen Grace leaving our house late at night with a small, safe-shaped bag. We included photos of the scratches on the lockbox and my ledger entries showing careful record-keeping. Every document was numbered and referenced in an index. Preparing the binder made me feel like I was building a bulwark of truth. At the same time, I made appointments for the required home study. A social worker named Mr. Alvarez visited our house to inspect the living conditions for Noah. He arrived with a clipboard and wore a kind smile. He walked through each room, checked the smoke detectors, and noted that we had a child-proof gate at the top of the stairs. He asked Noah what his favorite toy was and listened attentively as Noah described his train set. He spoke with Daniel and me separately about our routines, our support network, and our understanding of Noah's needs. He asked if there had been any history of domestic violence. Daniel's jaw tightened as he shook his head. Mr. Alvarez wrote quietly. He thanked us and said he would submit his report to the judge. Grace did not make the process easy. She refused to allow the social worker into her downstairs unit, claiming her privacy was being violated. She missed an appointment for a court-ordered psychological evaluation, citing illness. Her attorney filed motions to delay the hearing. The judge denied those motions, citing the urgency of protecting a minor. Grace's defiance did not endear her to the court, but I knew that one's demeanor could not replace evidence. We stuck to facts. 2 weeks before the hearing, a man knocked on my door carrying a clipboard. He introduced himself as a process server and handed me a thick envelope. Grace had petitioned for a conservatorship over me, alleging that I was incapable of managing my affairs. She claimed I was forgetful, misplacing objects, and making irrational decisions. Her petition included statements from 2 acquaintances I barely knew. One, a woman from our church choir, wrote that I had once forgotten the lyrics to a hymn and seemed confused. The other, a cashier from the grocery store, claimed I had left my change on the counter. Reading those exaggerations, my cheeks burned with anger and humiliation. Grace was trying to flip the narrative again, to portray me as incompetent so she could justify her actions and perhaps wrest control legally. I called Ms. Patel, who instructed me to undergo a cognitive assessment by a licensed psychologist to refute the claims. I scheduled the appointment and took the assessment, which included memory tests, problem-solving tasks, and a conversation about my daily life. The psychologist's report concluded that my cognition was within normal range for my age and that there were no signs of dementia. We added that report to our binder. As the hearing date approached, I also prepared emotionally. I rehearsed my testimony out loud, recounting the night I saw Grace in the kitchen and the steps that followed. I practiced staying calm while discussing the forged documents. I reminded myself not to engage with Grace's provocations in the courtroom. Daniel did the same. He wrote down his feelings and burned the paper in the fireplace as a symbolic release. We took Noah to the park and swung him under the leafy canopy to maintain a sense of normalcy. We ate simple meals and kept to a routine so he felt secure. The night before the hearing, I could not sleep. I lay in bed listening to the creak of the house as it settled and the distant hum of traffic. At midnight, I rose and went downstairs. I made tea and stood at the back door looking at the garden bathed in moonlight. Dew glistened on the leaves of the tomato plants. I thought of my husband and whispered a message into the darkness. "Give me strength tomorrow," I murmured. The air felt cooler as if in response. I took a deep breath, returned to bed, and drifted into a light sleep filled with half-formed dreams of courtrooms and voices. The morning of the hearing dawned crisp and clear. I dressed in a navy suit that my husband had always liked. It was simple and dignified. Daniel wore a gray jacket and a tie. He knelt to tie Noah's shoes with fingers that trembled slightly. We drove downtown together, the binder of exhibits buckled beside me like another passenger. Outside the courthouse, protesters held signs for an unrelated case, their voices echoing off the stone columns. We walked past them and through the metal detectors where security guards checked the binder. The courthouse smelled of old paper and new coffee. Fluorescent lights reflected off polished floors. Inside the courtroom, our case was listed on the docket as Thompson v. Roberts. The judge, a woman with silver hair and sharp eyes, presided. She wore no jewelry except her wedding band. The court clerk called our case number, and we approached the wooden tables. Ms. Patel stood beside us, her voice steady and clear. Grace sat at the opposite table with her attorney, a man I had never met, who whispered in her ear. She wore a black dress, and her expression was composed, but her hands twisted the fabric of her skirt. The pews behind us were sparsely filled with a few curious strangers and 2 friends of mine who had come for support. The judge asked us to state our names for the record. She reviewed the petitions and the motions filed by both sides. She explained that the hearing would consider whether Daniel and I should be granted temporary guardianship of Noah, and whether Grace's petition for my conservatorship had merit. She reminded everyone that the child's welfare was paramount and that she expected civility. Ms. Patel opened by presenting our exhibits. She introduced each piece, describing what it showed and why it was relevant. The judge examined the forged power of attorney, the notary's statement, the bank statements with unauthorized transfers, and the video footage of Grace attempting to access the lockbox. She listened as Ms. Patel read the threatening text aloud. She asked clarifying questions about the credit card application and the post office box. When Ms. Patel called me to testify, my heart hammered in my chest. I stood, raised my right hand, and swore to tell the truth. I described the night of the baby monitor. I explained my relationship with Grace, the trust I had extended, and the slow accumulation of small discrepancies. I handed the judge my ledger and pointed to entries. I spoke of the scratches on the lockbox dial, the forged notary receipt, and the moment I discovered my savings had been drained. I recounted the confrontation in the kitchen and the text I received. My voice wavered at times, but I kept it level with deep breaths. The judge listened without interrupting, her gaze steady. When I finished, I sat down feeling both exhausted and lighter. Daniel testified next. He admitted that he had signed the document without reading it, trusting his wife's explanation. He expressed his remorse and his commitment to protect his son. Tears glimmered as he described the moment he realized the depth of Grace's deceit. The judge asked if he and Grace had discussed her opening a credit card in my name. He shook his head. He told the judge that Grace had become defensive and secretive over the past year. He acknowledged that she was a good mother when she was present, but her actions toward me made him question her motives. When it was Grace's turn, her attorney objected to nearly every document, arguing that the video footage invaded her privacy and that the forged signature could not be proven without an expert witness. The judge overruled most objections, noting the clear chain of custody and the notary's affidavit. Grace took the stand and adopted a tone of injured innocence. She claimed that I had signed the power of attorney willingly and that I had simply forgotten. She insisted that the bank transfers were reimbursements for expenses she had incurred on my behalf, such as groceries and household repairs. She said the credit card had been opened with my verbal consent because my own credit card had a low limit. She teared up as she spoke of being portrayed as a thief. Ms. Patel cross-examined with calm precision. "How do you explain the threatening text message sent from the pawn shop number?" she asked. Grace blushed and shrugged. "It wasn't me," she said. "Someone must have spoofed my number." When asked about the notary's statement that she had not verified my identity, Grace responded that the notary was lying to protect her own job. Her answers grew more defensive as the questions continued. Then something unexpected happened. A woman stood up from the back row. She was in her late 20s, with tired eyes and a nervous expression. She whispered to the bailiff who approached the bench. The judge conferred quietly with counsel and then allowed the woman to speak. She introduced herself as Emily, a co-worker of Grace at a part-time job she had taken while studying. Emily testified that she and Grace had gone to the notary office together. She said she felt guilty for staying silent, but could not after hearing my testimony. She described how Grace had told her to act as witness and how Grace had laughed later about fooling an old woman. She apologized for her involvement and handed over a folded piece of paper, a receipt from the pawn shop with Grace's signature. The courtroom murmured. Grace's face lost its remaining color. Her attorney objected, but the judge allowed the evidence. Emily's testimony undermined Grace's narrative at a critical moment. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted after Emily's unexpected appearance. Truth has a way of piercing through carefully crafted stories, and the jurist senses when it does. Emily's hands trembled as she handed over the receipt. The clerk marked it as Exhibit 16. Ms. Patel asked Emily why she had decided to come forward now. Emily's voice shook as she replied that her conscience had haunted her, and that hearing my story had made her realize the harm her silence caused. The judge thanked her for her honesty and instructed the bailiff to take her statement under oath. Grace's attorney attempted to discredit Emily. He insinuated that she held a grudge against Grace over workplace disagreements. Emily shook her head and explained that she had no personal gain from testifying. She simply wanted to do the right thing. The judge noted that Emily had approached the court voluntarily and that her testimony aligned with other evidence. It was clear that the secondary character I had not known existed would now play a crucial role in the climax of this story. Sometimes help comes from unlikely places when justice is at stake. After the testimony concluded, the judge took a short recess to review the evidence. We sat in the hallway outside the courtroom on wooden benches worn smooth by years of anxious hands. Daniel tapped his foot nervously. I held Noah on my lap, his small hand clutching my fingers. He did not understand the gravity of the proceedings, but sensed our tension. He pointed to a mural on the wall showing scales and asked why there was a lady holding them. I whispered that the lady represented fairness. He nodded solemnly and traced the outline of her robe with his eyes. When court resumed, the judge delivered her ruling. She spoke slowly and deliberately. She acknowledged that family disputes over finances are painful and that the court must base its decision on evidence and the best interests of the child. She stated that the evidence presented showed a pattern of financial exploitation by Grace, including unauthorized transfers, forged documents, the opening of a credit card without consent, and attempts to discredit my mental capacity. She noted Grace's reluctance to comply with court orders and her evasive answers under oath. She praised Emily's courage in coming forward and recognized Daniel and my efforts to protect Noah. The judge granted temporary guardianship of Noah to Daniel and me, effective immediately, and suspended Grace's custody pending the outcome of the criminal investigation. She ordered Grace to vacate the lower unit of my house within 7 days. She granted a temporary restraining order prohibiting Grace from accessing my financial accounts or property. She also denied Grace's petition for conservatorship over me, citing the psychologist's report. In her closing remarks, she warned that elder financial abuse is a serious crime and that the district attorney would determine appropriate charges. The gavel struck once, echoing through the chamber, and the hearing was over. Relief washed over me like warm water. My knees felt weak. Daniel squeezed my hand. Noah giggled as if sensing the shift in mood. Grace sat at her table, lips pressed into a thin line, eyes smoldering. She whispered heatedly to her attorney, who shook his head. They gathered their papers and left the room without looking at us. My friend Wendy stood in the hallway and embraced me as we exited. "You were so brave," she whispered. I smiled through tears. Courage, I realized, is not an absence of fear, but a decision to act despite it. The following days were a flurry of logistics and emotions. A sheriff's deputy served Grace with the eviction order. She packed her belongings under supervision, her movements stiff. She muttered curses under her breath but complied. Daniel and I changed the locks and installed a new security system with door sensors and cameras. Noah asked where his mother was. Daniel knelt and explained that his mother loved him but had made mistakes and needed time to fix them. Noah nodded, his young mind accepting the simple explanation. The district attorney charged Grace with multiple counts of forgery, identity theft, and elder abuse. She was arrested 2 weeks after the hearing. Her arraignment drew little media attention, just a short paragraph in the local paper. She pled not guilty and was released on bail pending trial. Emily's testimony and the paper trail made conviction likely, Ms. Patel said. Even so, I felt a mixture of sadness and anger. I had hoped to build a family where we celebrated birthdays and holidays together. Instead, I sat with my grandson on my knee, reading court documents and planning depositions. I reminded myself that accountability is not cruelty. Allowing harmful behavior to continue would only worsen the damage. With Grace temporarily out of the picture, Daniel and I focused on healing. We signed up for family counseling to process the betrayal and to learn how to rebuild trust. The therapist, a soft-spoken man named Dr. Miller, met with us in a room lined with bookshelves and plants. He encouraged us to express our feelings without judgment. Daniel spoke of his guilt for not seeing the signs sooner. I spoke of my resentment and fear. Dr. Miller validated our emotions and guided us toward practical steps like creating joint budgets, setting clear boundaries, and sharing household responsibilities. Noah attended play therapy to help him process any confusion about the changes. As summer unfolded, new routines took hold. Daniel found a job at a local hardware store. He liked working with his hands and enjoyed helping people pick the right screwdriver or paint color. Noah started preschool 3 mornings a week, his backpack bouncing as he ran toward the classroom. I returned to volunteering at the library one afternoon a week, shelving books and recommending mysteries to patrons. We cooked meals together and ate at the same table where months earlier we had celebrated a birthday while secrets simmered. The air in the house felt lighter without the tension that had clung like humidity. The criminal trial began in August. Ms. Patel accompanied me to testify again. The courtroom looked similar, but this time a jury sat in the box, 12 faces turned toward the witness stand. The prosecutor laid out the evidence clearly. The defense attempted to argue that I had consented to the transactions and later changed my mind. They produced character witnesses who said Grace was a loving mother. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. They returned a verdict of guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced Grace to 2 years in county jail and 3 years probation, along with restitution to be paid from any future income. She also ordered Grace to attend financial counseling and to have no contact with me or Noah outside of court-approved visitation. Watching someone you once shared meals with be led away in handcuffs is surreal. I felt no joy, only a sense of gravity. Accountability is necessary, but it does not erase the pain. After the verdict, Emily approached me outside the courthouse. She had attended the trial each day. She apologized again and said she had learned a hard lesson about going along with wrongdoing. I thanked her for her courage. Without her, the outcome could have been different. Life gradually settled into a new normal. We sold the idea of revenge to our hearts as something we did not need. Instead, we sought justice through the law and healing through time. I gardened, pruning my roses back to encourage new growth. I taught Noah how to bake cookies, letting him lick the spoon and watch the dough rise through the oven window. Daniel and I attended court-mandated co-parenting classes that taught us how to support Noah's relationship with his mother without exposing him to harm. Grace wrote letters from jail, expressing remorse and asking for forgiveness. She admitted to succumbing to greed and envy. She wrote that she never intended to hurt Noah. I read the letters with a mixture of skepticism and hope. People can change, but change requires acknowledgement and effort. In the fall, the judge granted supervised visitation for Grace once a month. Noah met his mother in a room at the County Family Services building, painted with murals of forests and rivers. A social worker sat nearby as they played with blocks. Noah hugged her. Grace cried softly. Daniel watched through a one-way glass window. Afterward, we took Noah for ice cream and answered his simple questions with simple answers. Children do not need the weight of adult complexities, only the assurance that they are loved and safe. Through counseling and time, Daniel and I repaired our bond. He expressed admiration for my strength. I told him that his willingness to see the truth in act had given me courage. We learned that boundaries are an act of love. We no longer allowed our generosity to be exploited. We drafted clear financial agreements, even between family members, and kept each other informed. We also welcomed support. Friends brought casseroles and offered to babysit. Our community rallied around us when they heard what had happened. Their kindness reminded me that while betrayal stings, compassion soothes. As for Grace, I do not know what the future holds. She will one day finish her sentence and rebuild her life. I hope she finds the humility to change. I hope she understands that money gained through deception brings only destruction. I hope she truly loves Noah enough to prioritize his well-being over her own pride. Time will tell. Meanwhile, I will continue to plant tomatoes, read bedtime stories, and sit at my kitchen table writing in my ledger. I will continue to believe that the law exists to protect the vulnerable, and that love can endure even when relationships fracture. Months have now turned into a year since the night I saw Grace on the baby monitor. When I look back at that grainy image, I see not just a woman opening a cupboard, but a warning that my family was at a crossroads. The path we chose was not the path of vengeance, but the route of accountability and healing. It led us through courtrooms and counseling sessions, through tears and affidavits, through nights of doubt and mornings of resolve. Along the way, I learned lessons I wish I had never needed, but am grateful to carry. I learned that love does not mean blind trust. Healthy boundaries protect relationships rather than harm them. I learned that evidence matters more than emotion when seeking justice. Keeping receipts, logs, and notes may feel tedious until they become the threads that weave a safety net. I learned that manipulative people often try to turn the narrative against their victims. Staying calm and factual can disarm their tactics. I learned that the law can be a source of strength for families in crisis, providing structure and consequences where personal pleas fail. I also learned that forgiveness and accountability are not mutually exclusive. I can hope for Grace's rehabilitation while still holding her responsible for what she did. I can nurture Noah's love for his mother while ensuring he is protected. I can remember good memories and still acknowledge the harm. Healing is not linear. Some days the hurt flares when I pass the consignment shop where she sold my bracelet, or when I see a power of attorney form. Other days I feel peace as I watch Noah nap in the afternoon light, his chest rising and falling with steady rhythm. Our community played a role in our recovery. Wendy's video and Emily's testimony remind me that neighbors and acquaintances can become unexpected allies. Friends who dropped off meals and offered rides to court supported us when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm. Our church choir sang louder, knowing that the hymns carried us through. People at the library asked how I was doing and truly listened. Each act of kindness was a pebble on the scale tipping us toward hope. Looking ahead, Daniel and I plan to continue building a life anchored in transparency and respect. We set up a college savings account for Noah with both of us as custodians. We updated our wills to clarify our wishes. We meet monthly to review finances together over coffee. These are not acts of distrust but of stewardship. We speak openly about our feelings, even when the conversation is uncomfortable. We celebrate small victories, like Noah learning to tie his shoes or me mastering a new recipe. We give thanks for the ordinary days that once felt impossible. There are other families who have walked paths similar to ours. I heard of a sister who discovered her brother forging checks and quietly gathered bank statements before calling the authorities. I read about a grandmother who set up a hidden camera and caught her niece selling heirlooms to fund a gambling habit. These stories remind me that we are not alone and that speaking up can help others recognize their own red flags. Sharing our experiences creates a tapestry of cautionary tales and survival strategies. As I sit at my kitchen table now, the baby monitor has been retired. Noah no longer needs it, and I no longer need to watch my kitchen after midnight. The safe still sits in its cupboard, but its code has changed. My ledger is thicker, filled with entries of daily joys and occasional worries. The smell of coffee brewing mixes with the scent of fresh roses on the windowsill. I glance at the clock, note the time, and smile at the thought that somewhere someone is hearing this story in a different time zone, perhaps with their own tea cooling beside them. Our lives are woven with threads of trust, betrayal, justice, and redemption. My hope is that by telling this story, I have added a strand of caution and courage to that weave. What would you have done if you saw a loved one cross a line between desperation and deceit? And how might stories like the one about the sister with the forged checks or the grandmother with the hidden camera help you decide? Reflect on that question, and may your answer guide you toward choices that honor both justice and compassion,